Okay, yeah. So it's the good morning squat, the tipping in the squat is something that I've struggled with my whole like lifting career. Ever since I started CrossFit like 9 years ago, I had like the most hingy squat. Meant like stuff like deadlifts, never had a problem like improving that at a decent rate. Stuff like shoulder to overheads, never really had a problem improving that at a decent rate. But my squat always like pretty much like had plateaued and didn't get better for years and years and years, and it was really really frustrating for me.
Mhm.
I coach a few people as well that struggle with the same fault. Um, so yeah, it's definitely something that's that I really want to get to the bottom of. Um, and the reason why it's a problem is because the body's moved into a mechanically disadvantageous position without moving the barbell commensurately.
Yeah.
So the bar's no longer over the midfoot. You're fighting to stay upright. You're applying as much force as possible, but not in the right place and not in the right areas. So yeah, that's kind of why I want to talk about it with you today.
Yeah, I think it's a very common issue that a lot of people face. And whenever the body does something that we don't expect it to, I think my thought process is always like, why is it doing that? Because it has to offer some advantage. Otherwise, it wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And we know that a straight bar path, keeping the bar over the midfoot, like you said, is the most efficient way to get the bar from A to B. But the body is moving away from that to try and stand up a squat that we presume it could not stand up if it maintains that bar path. So that means the advantages it gains from tipping outweigh the biomechanic or the just pure mechanics disadvantage of increasing that lever length away from the midfoot. So then the next question to me is like, well, what are the advantages of doing that? And it does vary person to person. You know, some people are able to maintain beautiful upright back squats where the bar path is perfect, and they almost never tip, even when they're getting super heavy and maxing
Yeah.
out. So why do those people stay upright when another population of people tip over once they get close to 1 rep maxing? And if we use the principles we learn on the mentorship of we want to lengthen muscles to activate them, like you said, you never struggled with your deadlift and hingy movements. By tipping, you do lengthen the glutes, you do lengthen the hamstrings, and you'll get even length through the lumbar erectors as well. So that kind of
Yeah.
almost most of the posterior chain, you'll get more of that activation and stretch reflex, which can then help you, like you say, good morning, the squat up to the top. Obviously, this isn't necessarily the primary stimulus we want for doing a back squat. If we want to use it for leg strength, then we're kind of working around that knee flexion and extension, which is part of the desired training stimulus.
Yeah.
So then we have to think about how can we encourage the body to load in our preferred manner. Have there been any things that you've used over the years that have yielded some success in your own or others' training?
Yeah. So the aim is to try and keep this squat movement as squatty as possible. So stuff like hack squats have been quite helpful for me and my clients, stuff like
Yeah.
leg press machines, zombie squats where you've got like the
Yeah.
bar on the shoulders. That's going to really encourage you to that's going to really encourage like an upright squat posture.
Yeah.
Anderson squats from the pins, so like bottom up squats with a
Yeah.
really slow eccentric, and on the way down like 6 seconds, like well anywhere between like 3 to 6 seconds is probably optimal, but trying to stay as upright, trying to stay as quaddy as possible on the way down.
Yeah.
Because on the way up I would always just like I'd still hinge my way up
Yeah.
but a lot less. And then it was important just on the way down to try and like stay as upright as possible. And
Awesome.
they have given me some success and they've
Yeah.
given my clients like some success. But at the same time, is there something else that can be done that could be more cost effective? Like, is I don't really want to give my clients like hack squat, leg press, zombie squat, Anderson squats in a whole week's worth of training. That's a lot
Yeah.
of stress on the nervous system
Yeah.
potentially. Is there some mechanical exercises that we can use potentially that are going to give you me the same the same stimulus?
Yeah.
but without the taxing of the nervous system. And that's kind of what I wanted, why I wanted to speak to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're on basically the right path, or you are on the right path anyway with those exercise selections. Is when we think about what's holding somebody back from maintaining better bar path and from a more upright posture, is that they are stronger leaning into that posterior chain with a, in air quotes, bad bar path, as compared to staying more upright. So we want their knee extension to catch up with their hip extension, essentially.
Yeah.
So you're going about it in a really nice way where
Yeah.
you're using different setups to either block decompensation or encourage the better motor pattern that you want. So zombie squats is the perfect exercise in that if you tip forwards, the bar rolls along your arms and you lose the lift. So the amount of load that can be lifted will be constrained by the power to stay upright and squat using a more knee dominant squat. So that's a very targeted way to build a more similar type of strength. The other approach that maybe isn't in those exercises is you can exaggerate the fault to teach the body. It's almost like sending a more clear signal to the body, this is what's going wrong and this is how to correct it. So when they're leaning into, like using good mornings as the obvious example, when they're leaning into that position, can they use strength elsewhere to maintain a more upright torso to resist that? But that will be limited by their capacity. Like they'll be able to resist tipping forwards, but it won't give them the squat strength to stand up with the right mechanics. So that will build the positional awareness, but you still need to build the squatty strength.
So what you're saying is are you kind of like accepting that potentially you're always going to probably move like this? So we're going to strengthen the way that you're always going to lift. Is that kind of what you're saying, or
there's two ways to think about it. It depends what your goal is, right? If you want to squat the most weight the soonest, then I would do both. Like strengthen your compensation pattern so that you can then just lift more in that same pattern and you're more robust against the like overload of the posterior chain. Because if you're strong in your erectors, your glutes, and your hamstrings, and they're what's doing the lifting, they are also what's limiting how much you can lift. So actually adding more quad strength when you're not really using your quads to lift won't increase your numbers that much. It will improve your squat pattern, but it's not necessarily going to be the first thing that increases your squat numbers. Like in most scenarios, I imagine it would. If your goal is just to squat looking better, then you can almost leave your posterior chain on simmer whilst trying to get your quads to catch up. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was the concept of maintaining balance around that midfoot.
Yeah.
And kipping gymnastics is actually a great way to understand this, in that when you're kipping, there's pretty much always 50% of your body behind the bar and 50% in front of the bar. That's what stops you rotating around going into a glide kip. And we want that to be the same in the bar path of our squat as well. So if our midfoot is the center point, we want 50% of our weight behind the center point and 50% of our weight in front of the center point combined with the barbell. And what a lot of people who tip forwards are predisposed to doing that, or the reason why they're predisposed to doing that, is that they are in a overall globally extended posture. So their body is arched and shifting them forwards onto their forefoot, because for most things that's advantageous. It helps you run faster forwards. It helps you express force and power in your Olympic weightlifting, but it isn't necessarily the best for mobility and maintaining balance in something like a back squat. So another strategy you can use for teaching people to stay balanced is keeping a little bit more weight back in the foot, and what we would say is bringing them back in the gait cycle. So if their body is kind of in toe off mode, where it's always propelling them forwards, teaching them to come back towards heel strike, where they're a little bit more heel heavy and more of their body mass is behind. So one of the classic areas you see this is through the spine. If somebody is extended and arched through their back, that's sending mass forwards into the forefoot, which again is like a propulsion biased posture. So that's whenever we're propelling, we're creating stiffness, and think about toe off. That's when all the muscles shorten and drive you forwards. Whereas in a squat, we need a certain amount of length through those tissues. So actually being a little bit more heel heavy allows a bit more of that relative motion.
So is that heel heavy on the ascent and the descent of the squat?
Yes. For the people who are tipping forwards, they need to bring the mass backwards in the foot to stay. Like when they tip forwards, usually the heels will start to, if not lift, the pressure will lighten in the heels. So we need to teach them to keep the bar and their body slightly backwards relative to the balance point. And being overly extended through the spine is one of the most common reasons why people do that. So teaching them to actually brace in a more flexed spine position allows the knees and the hips to be more forward, because the upper body is more back. Does that make sense? Because if your chest is forwards, your knees and hips have to go back to maintain that 50-50 and stop you falling over. So if we want something to go forwards, generally the knees, something else has to come back, generally the rib cage and the T-spine. So that's another addition to the exercises we've already spoken about. Zercher squats, which I know you do a lot of as well, can teach you to brace in that more flexed spine position. And it's a nice setup for driving the knees forward, knees and hips forward, to press, like think of it almost like a leg press from that position, rather than just lifting the bar. Like a lot of people, when they're lifting the bar in a Zercher squat, will make it hingy because that's where they're strongest. But rather than thinking about getting the bar up, think about leg pressing the floor away, and leaving the upper body relatively constant will help keep that weight and force production from where we want it in the knees. Those are probably the first ones I'd go to. The other one that's nice from it's more of like a patterning mechanics one. It's slightly less strength bias, but you can load it up with dumbbells. And that is the slouching squat, which you might have seen people do online. My advice with that one is taking your time in the setup to ensure the balance point is where you want it to be. So it doesn't have to be heel heavy. You don't even have to have your heel fully down on the floor, but it does need to be midfoot. So the way I teach it is like, pretend you're doing your laces. So go down into that sort of split squat, narrow split squat position, and round your back as much as you would to bend over and do your laces. And then from that position, you want to keep your knee as far forwards as possible to keep it quad dominant, whilst making the balance or the key pressure point in your foot be in your midfoot. Like think of like the front of your heel, even if it's not on the floor, that's where you're pushing the down into. And the most important part to keep the stimulus on knee extension, or at least quad strength, excuse me, is keeping the knee forwards for as long as possible. So actually we want to learn to extend the hip with the knees forwards, is actually the secret to using your quads in a squat. Does that make sense? So it's still hip extension, but it's hip extension in a position where the knee is loaded. So your knee flexion angle won't be changing that much, but your quads are still working very hard. And that's a great way for people to build awareness of where their mass is relative to their balance point. And a lot of people just doing that body weight, their leg will start shaking because they've never loaded their quads in that way if the balance point is right. But then as soon as the knee comes back like 2 centimeters, it's easy because they're in their posterior chain that they're very comfortable with. So it's a nice patterning exercise you can use to combine with the Zercher and the zombie squats. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So the tipping happens when the knee extensors aren't able to apply as much force at the same rate as the hip extensors. So that still holds true.
Yes, or they could be unable to maintain the position for like because their mobility prevents them from keeping the hips forwards. So when they're pressing into the ground, yeah, which is related but not exactly the same.
But and that mobility, the lack of mobility, is that usually in the at the hips and at the feet?
Yeah, hips primarily. So with those two exercises, also with the slouching split squat, because it's single leg, one of the reasons it helps is that it takes away part of the hip mobility requirement for bilateral squatting. So if like it's like a stripper type mobilization where if you squat next to a rig, get right down to the bottom of it, and the goal is to pull your hips and knees as far forwards as possible to kind of recreate that slouching squat position. So bottom of a squat, naturally your bum will go back a little bit, but you can pull on the rig to pull your hips, pelvis forwards. The cue I give to my male clients is try and get your balls between your feet, because naturally your hips will be back, but think about bringing them all the way forwards. And to do so, your knees have to go forwards. And if your knees and your hips are forwards, your torso will be more upright. And a lot of people just getting into that position will feel very restricted through their hips. So it's your adductors, but it's also like your pelvic floor needs to be able to lengthen to get you into that position. So if you can't even get into the position, you can't create force from that position. So that's a nice way to mobilize, getting the knees and hips forwards whilst practicing pushing into the floor. So you can do some gentle pulses, pushing your feet into the floor from that position. And people who tip forward in the squat, as they push into the floor, their hips will want to shoot backwards to lean into where they're already strong and where they're comfortable. But the purpose of this drill is to teach them, no, the hips aren't allowed back. We're going to use the upper body to anchor and pull the knees and hips forwards and learn to drive out the hole, maintaining upright posture. And so that's another sort of sensory drill and mobilization that you can use to build comfort in the knees forwards, hips forwards position. But the words of caution I have is that if somebody's been squatting for a long time and they are strong, can lift a lot already, they're going to have to massively reduce the amount they lift in this new style, because those tissues just haven't been stressed to the same level as their posterior chain has. Like if they've gone from low bar back squatting to high bar or like zombie squatting, you can see a huge percentage drop in terms of the amount of weight possibly lifted. So just proceed with caution, but then you expect your standard squat to benefit from those biomechanical efficiencies.
Yeah, because it's got to the point now where myself included and the clients that do have this fault, I don't prescribe them back squats anymore. Like, I might give them like a safety bar squat as like the heaviest kind of like squat that they're going to be doing, but it is mostly front squats, zombie squats, Zercher squats. And I think that's probably quite a good thing, because it's going to stop them from like arching their back, right? And that's kind of like leads the movement.
Exactly. Yeah, you want them to extend from the lower body, not the lower back.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Is in terms of like prescription of the kind of what did you put that slouchy squat in terms of prescription, frequency, what would you kind of recommend?
Like everything, it depends on who they are and what they want and what they can tolerate. With that, like the first time somebody does it, they'll generally be quite beaten up, but you could do it, you could treat it like a movement mechanics piece and do it 3-4 times a week, no problem, if you're not burying yourself with intensity.
And then you're supersetting it with one of your other exercises.
Exactly. Yeah. If you go from that into a Zercher or something, you won't be able to necessarily lift as much in the Zercher, but the pattern will be fresh in their minds and carry through to the main squat. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. All right. Well, I'll be doing those today, and I'll give you some updates on how it goes.
Awesome.
I've never tried those slouchy squats before, but I have seen them. So yeah, it's a very like flex spine position, isn't it?
Exactly.
And that's going to be like different from what I've been used to. So yeah, that's really cool.
It's one of the things we do in the alumni in taking out the lower back. You can either use a setup where you're like hand supported, or you don't allow the back to flex at all, so almost staying in an extended spine, or you can actually maximally flex your spine so it can't flex any further.
Yeah.
And that's another way you can stop it from interfering. So actually getting into that slouching squat, the key thing is just going super slow and pressing the floor away without letting the knee come back. And don't try and stand up. Like a lot of people try and stand up and puff their chest, but you actually kind of want to finish it still flexed and slouched over. It's just a leg press.
I even noticed that I do that in my like rear leg elevated split squats. I'm going down and I just like hike up with my back and chest to rise up. And again, I think I was giving those exercises. I was giving like rear leg elevated split squats as another like accessory movement to these clients that are struggling with this fall. And I was noticing them just kind of like actually almost exaggerating the fall and like reinforcing the fall. So yeah, I think it's made me realize like we need to stay flexed, we need to stay over that front leg, we need to try and prioritize that knee extension before the hip extension. So yeah,
sorry, just to be clear on that one, the knee extension doesn't have to be before the hip extension. If anything, the hip extension should be before the knee extension, but the knee needs to be forwards and loaded. So it's when the knees shoot back that we get hip extension after knee extension. Does that make sense? So you actually, and the back extension is mainly the thing we want to avoid, because hip extension is a good thing, but if we've got hip extension and back extension instead of hip extension and knee extension, we can't stay upright.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome. Anything else I can help with?
Does that mean like less? I'm going to be getting like less back pumps, hopefully.
Yes, definitely. That's it. Yeah. When you're not leaning over, you don't lengthen the back muscles, so they don't do as much work. It's one of the benefits of getting more upright. But you might need to supplement that elsewhere. Make sure you keep your flexion training going.
Awesome. That's really good about me. Like, I think I was probably on the right track anyway, but I've always like more recently, I just like had thoughts like there are other ways of approaching this and other things at play here.
Definitely. Yeah, I think you're massively on the right lines. And like you say, it was working anyway. But I think with those subtle tweaks, you can keep it a bit more specific, a bit more squatty, and really emphasize the key aspect of getting the hips and knees forwards whilst getting that leg press strength. Because you could do leg press and you would develop strength in those areas, but you wouldn't necessarily improve the control of the balance point, like being able to control your mass. That's the other benefit of the slouching squat, is because you're getting flexed in the spine. That helps you keep your back backwards in space, which allows the knees forwards. Whereas if you're extended through the spine, you can't have your chest forwards and your knees forwards, otherwise you'll fall forwards. So that's how we get the back in space.
And you did mention as well, like the adductors are probably people that are tight in the adductors tend to kind of like demonstrate this particular pattern. So do you think some targeted like adductor lengthening work could be beneficial as well?
For sure. Yeah. And that's why, so doing like wide squats would be a good option for that. But that sort of stripper mobilization on the rig is a big adductor mobility piece. Like if somebody is tight there, they'll feel it there. And playing with the width of the stance will be the key to success. And if you go too wide, their range will completely shut down. They won't be able to get to any depth. But if you go too narrow, you're not stretching the adductors anymore, and that might limit your depth anyway, just because you're narrow. So yeah, you'll feel it once you get down there on the rig and you sort of move your hips around, push your pelvis forwards and back. You'll feel where the tight corners are, and you'll see how you have to either like flex through the spine or do something else just to exist in that position. And the goal is obviously to have a good upright torso without a huge compensation from any other area of the body.
Would you be able to send me like an example of that? Like I'm picturing it in my head, but I'm not 100% sure if I'm like fully like grasping like what that looks like.
For sure.
The
yeah, I've got it. It should be on the YouTube channel, but I'll dig it out. If not, I've got it from clients that I've prescribed it to. So I'll be able to get you a video for sure.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, thanks, Ash. I know obviously you're a busy man, and your time is valuable, so I really appreciate you today. What time is it there?
5:10 p.m. So
yeah. You better get to paddle now. Then I'll let you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, get down with the old men. Yeah. All right, mate. I'll end the recording here if I know how to.